a little bit about this sort of first, so we started in Thessalonica. What stood out to you?
Well, the very first part of the trip, Roxanne, we spent time in Thessalonica. So Thessalonica is the, if you will, the half-sister of Alexander the Great. So that's why it's called Thessaloniki. It's his sister. And so what's extraordinary about Thessalonica is it was one of the capitals of the northern part of what we call Greece now, Macedonia in that area. And it was a place that was so rich, so powerful in what it offered, not only to the community, to the Romans at that time, but obviously to Alexander. And what Alexander the Great would do is he basically would Hellenize that region from Greece all the way to northern India, to northwestern India. And when he did that, he Hellenized this region. That's why we called it, one of the beauties of how that Alexander the Great, who was obviously, we're talking about 300 years before Christ had come to this earth. He Hellenized that entire region, and how that becomes significant for us as Christians is we often wonder, why was the Bible written in Greek when most of the disciples were Jewish, or for that matter, Christ? It's because of when Alexander the Great came there, he Hellenized it so that the common language there at that time was Greek. So what English is today around the world, we would say it's a language that's becoming more universal around the world, is what Greek was back then. And it's so important to realize that, so that these disciples would write, obviously St. Paul writing his letters, would write them in the Greek language, because in large part of what Alexander the Great had done in Hellenizing that region. And it's amazing, St. Paul, being a major leader within the Roman governance, but also a faithful Jewish person, and as many people had remarked, many historians had remarked, that St. Paul was really on the fast track to being a major significant figure within all of Judaism at that time. When he has this extraordinary experience on the road to Damascus, in which he hears the voice of God saying, "Saul, Saul, why do you continue to crucify me? Why are you crucifying me?" And it was such a powerful thing that he's blinded, as you remembered. And when we went to Syria, Roxanne, we remember almost over a decade ago, how he
walked that road.
Yeah, he would walk a tremendous path to the home of Ananias. Mm-hmm. And ultimately through, the scales off of his eyes would be revealed, and he would be able to see, and it could transform his life. And so when we were in Thessalonica this time, you could see just how powerful it was for him to be able to and how significant that place was for him to go to and to begin sharing that message of Christ in a time in which it was, we have to keep in mind this, friends, that it was illegal to be a Christian. Christianity, there's an edict of Milan that many of you who are Orthodox Christians may be aware of, that was an edict by Constantine the Great that basically allowed the toleration of Christians. But the actual Christianity being the official religion of the Roman Empire does not happen at that time. It happens almost 70 years later, close to 390 AD. So for all these years, it's illegal to be a Christian. So when you go to Thessalonica, and then shortly thereafter we would go into Philippi, where St. Paul, while he was in Philippi, we would walk into a large theater, Roxanne, and this theater would fill thousands and thousands of people. They still have, in the center of this theater, Roxanne, a large area where they would keep all of the animals, the lions, the tigers, that they would pull back these little coverings that were under the amphitheater. And as our Christian brothers back then, the martyrs, would be gladiators at that time, they would pull this thing back, and the people would be spectators watching as these Christians, who could have easily chosen not to profess their faith, could have easily chosen not to die that way, would be tortured and obviously killed by the animals that were there, that the Romans would love to do and set as an example to those Christians. And you would think that that would have stopped Christianity, but it didn't. Quite the opposite. And St. Paul would go to that area, Roxanne, and would preach in those areas, knowing this, that what was going to happen.
I mean, how incredible. How early was Thessalonica in St. Paul's ministry? Obviously, he was not in prison until Philippi, I would imagine.
Right. So he goes to Philippi before going to Thessalonica. So when you go to Philippi, which we actually walked on the city of Philippi, which is extraordinary, the Obviously, I mentioned earlier about the theater, but also just the extraordinary landscape of that. So when you go into where Philippi is, it's amazing how in the early Christian church they would build basilicas on top of the prison that St. Paul was held at. And that prison, Roxanne, is just a small, it's different than what we would understand as a jail cell in today's world. These were oftentimes lower in the ground. They would be areas that would be oftentimes no circulation, no ventilation. There's no windows to look through, just simply a concrete block, and you were stuck in the middle of it. So it's beautiful that the Orthodox Church would build these churches over where St. Paul was
where he was imprisoned.
Where he was imprisoned. And we remember in the book of Acts, such an extraordinary book that really, Acts 16 through 19, really kind of opened the entire door of St. Paul's ministry. But when he was in Philippi, and as you remember in Acts 16, when he's basically this sorcerer, as the scriptures talk about it, or some called even a fortune teller, but someone that was really possessed with a demon possession, but was making money for other people, when she confronts St. Paul, and he basically rids her of this possession that she's has been compelled by. That when they do that, obviously the people that own this woman, she's a slave, she's basically a servant to these men, they end up complaining to the leadership, and then they throw Paul and Silas in jail. And what's beautiful, Roxanne, is while they're in jail, we remember how when they're in the middle of the night and God speaks to them and ultimately frees them, that when the doors open, these people come out of this. They could have easily chose to run away, but they stay there. And the prisoner, the prison guard at that time, we don't know his name. We just simply know, at least in Scripture, we don't know his name. But we know that he was so tormented when he saw that that the chains were no longer on them. And back then, which I didn't realize this, back then, if you were a prison guard and you had allowed a prisoner to be free, it was punishable by your death. Mm-hmm. And so here he was reaching for the sword, which we see in Scripture, but but St. Paul intervenes and says, stop that. You don't need to do that. And then he says, how can I be saved? And it's such an extraordinary experience. So we were there at that place where the shackles were released and freed, and Paul and Silas, as we hear in Scripture, were singing joys and singing gratitude. And prior to that moment, we all know that the very first Christian that was baptized was a woman named Lydia. We hear about her. The very first Christian that's recorded in Scripture that in Europe that was baptized was that of Lydia. And what an amazing story. We actually went to where she was baptized, and an amazing person as well. And so oftentimes in the Orthodox tradition, Roxanne, Lydia is the first person that's baptized. The second person, we would say, is that prison guard.